Begun. I should say good evening and thank you for joining us for this roundtable discussion of decolonizing activism. My name is Nicole Simic, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this event, which is co-hosted this year by the Gender Studies program and the Race and Ethnic Studies program. So we are, as I mentioned, we are recording now, so we can make this session available to anyone who wasn't able to attend live tonight. So this is actually the first time I think that I'm pretty sure that the research roundtable has been virtual, and coming together and apart right now, I think probably makes us even more aware of the locations from which we're speaking. So we'd like to begin then by acknowledging the land that Whitman College is on and that I'm speaking to you from tonight. I think that many of the panelists are speaking from tonight. This land is the traditional territory of the Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla tribes. And this land was ceded in 1855 to the US government, resulting in the relocation of the tribes to the Umatilla Indian Reservation and allowing for the establishment of Whitman Seminary, which is now Whitman College 4 years later. So we wanted to begin with that acknowledgement because we are thinking about decolonizing activism. And we're particularly interested in this topic and really excited to reflect on it in relation to the college-wide academic theme this year that Whitman has adopted: race, violence, and health. Decolonization as theory and practice has become a central focus in discussions of anti-racist futures. What we're asking, what specific post or decolonial vision should we be fighting for? How have activists worked towards decolonization, and how do colonial logics continue to haunt activist work itself? And then to what counts as activism in a given time and place? How is academic work related to activism? What role does theory come to play in shaping activism and political struggles? And we come to this topic every year. The annual Gender Studies Research Roundtable really is an opportunity to share work in progress with scholars and students who are coming to that topic from very different vantage points. So we see this event in the program as a chance for all of us together to examine the methodological differences and complexities involved in studying race, gender, and sexuality within and across disciplines. And it's also a chance to get to know the many varied academic and professional paths that we can take as scholars, as practitioners, or activists who are invested in these questions. Many people made this event possible, and I wanted to thank in particular Deborah Moorhead for her administrative assistance, Charles Marr and the instructional media staff for the logistics and the webinar help, and Champa Biswas for her advice and help publicizing this event and its relationship to the academic theme. I'm especially pleased and thankful to pleased to welcome our panelists and thankful to them for their willingness to speak tonight. Our first speaker is Lydia McDermott, Associate Professor of Rhetoric, Writing, and Public Discourse here at Whitman. Professor McDermott's scholarship focuses on the intersections of rhetoric and material bodies, especially along the axes of sex, gender, race, and disability. Her book, Liminal Bodies, Reproductive Health and Feminist Rhetoric, Searching the Negative Spaces in Histories of Rhetoric, came out in 2016 with Lexington Press, and it is now available in paperback. Yay. And the title of her talk tonight is Cripping the Decolonial and Decolonizing Disability Studies, or the Universal Design of Colonizing Metaphors. Our second speaker is Zahi Zalloua, Cushing-Eales Professor of Philosophy and Literature, Director of Race and Ethnic Studies, and Professor of French and Gender Studies, also here at Whitman. His most recent publications include Being Posthuman, Ontologies of the Future, which is forthcoming in a few months, Zizek on Race, Toward an Anti-Racist Future, Theories, Autoimmunity, Skepticism, Literature, and Philosophy, and Continental Philosophy and the Palestinian Question, Beyond the Jew and the Greek. Professor Zalloua's talk tonight is titled A Transnational Plea for Me Too. And the final speaker tonight is Özge Serin, who will discuss the topic Violence and Civility in Times of Riots and Uprisings. Professor Serin is Visiting Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Politics at Whitman. Her scholarship centers around histories of radical politics, formations of violence, and carceral cultures. She's the co-editor of a special issue of Boundary 2 entitled Marxism, Communism, and Translation, and has published articles on the language of Marxism and the temporality of the death fast, as well as completed an experimental documentary, Death/Fast. She's working on a book manuscript titled Writing of Death, Ethics and Politics of the Hunger Strike. So our event tonight will be divided into two parts. So during the first portion of the roundtable, our speakers will each take 10 to 15 minutes to present their work. After that, we'll open up the floor for conversation among the panelists and with you, the audience. So as I mentioned, audience members, you can use the Q&A button to post your questions at any point. You can also post anonymously. And then when we get to the Q&A section, I'll read out the questions aloud and do my best to get to as many of them as possible. So with that, I'll turn the mic over to Professor McDermott.
Thank you, Nicole. And I am actually going to paste in the chat, and hopefully people can find it. This is just a link so that if you need an accessible copy of my talk, it's there, as well as the PowerPoint slides. And now I will share my screen, hopefully. There we go. Okay. Can everybody see? Okay. I know for me, people's faces are in the middle of it, so sorry if that is the case. So cripping the decolonial and decolonizing disability studies, or the universal design of colonial metaphors. Before I begin, I need to make a few acknowledgements, and I thank Nicole for her land acknowledgement. The first acknowledgement I need to make, aside from that, is that I am a white, visibly able-bodied cis woman living in the US. I'm honored to participate in this roundtable on a topic that is newer to my research, which centers on reproductive justice. Though I've lived a life palpably affected by disability, my perspective is not the perspective I am advocating for in this talk. In fact, my perspective as a white academic in the US is a perspective that needs to be de-emphasized in an effort to decolonize disability studies. That being said, I hope that the scholars I draw in here and that I list in my references can lead you to new perspectives. The other acknowledgement I want to make is that as a scholar working within disability rhetoric, I'm dedicated to attempting to make my scholarship and teaching as accessible to as many people as possible. Therefore, I will be choosing whenever possible to use the plainest, most straightforward language I can. The script is available for you at the website there and is in large font for anyone who needs that. So my title already seems to be disobeying the principle of plain language that I just laid out, so I want to unpack a few terms. First, disability studies. DS, often shortened to DS, is a transdisciplinary intellectual and activist project that takes as its starting point the idea that the experience of disability, rather than an individual medical affliction or irredeemable tragedy, is both a marginalized cultural identity and an epistemic perspective with disruptive analytical potential. That's from Dearth and Adams. So disability provides a standpoint from which to make knowledge and to critique the status quo. DS scholars usually adhere to what is called a social model of disability that suggests the social and physical environment in which a person with an impairment exists disables them. This is in opposition to a medical model which locates the source of disability in the individual and seeks to cure the individual of the disability. Like many activist ideas that are turned into academic fields in the US, there are problems with DS, hence new areas of study have emerged. For instance, critical disability studies, CDS, and global disability studies, GDS, both of which I'll explain further a little later. Each of these intervenes in order to account for a critical absence of perspective. Universal design is a principle grown out of architecture and applied to various fields, including the classroom in universal design for instruction. The design principle suggests that a full variety of body minds should be anticipated users in the initial construction of a site, and that design features that take disabled body minds into account benefit all body minds. This is in opposition to the more general move to retrofit, by adding accessible features to older sites, like ramps at the back of a building or accommodations in a classroom. Cripping is a verb and borrowed from theorists Robert McCrory, Alison Kafer, and Carrie Santhal. In turn, crip theory draws on queer theory to suggest that our culture functions under a compulsory able-bodiedness and able-mindedness. Cripping is meant to purposefully draw attention to and disrupt these ableist systems. As Kafer has noted, the word is supposed to make you cringe. Decolonial is a term that you're hearing about from all of us and around which the whole panel is organized. For now, I'll forward this definition from Maldonado Torres, which I like, but which is also limited. Decoloniality refers to efforts at rehumanizing the world, to breaking hierarchies of difference that dehumanize subjects and communities and that destroy nature, and to the production of counter-discourses, counter-knowledges, counter-creative acts, and counter-practices that seek to dismantle coloniality and to open up multiple other forms of being in the world. I'll add to this that to do decolonial work is to actively work to redress colonial violences. Okay, so now that those terms have been covered, I want to discuss the claims my title is making. First, that the decolonial needs to be cripped. Second, that disability studies needs to be decolonized. There's a third claim there about universal design that's a bit tongue-in-cheek, because by attaching universal design to colonial metaphors, I am highlighting the insidious pervasiveness of colonial thinking. Colonial metaphors are designed to be universally applicable to a variety of marginalized groups and body minds, not to increase access, but to strategically limit access. To support all of these claims, first, I'd like to illustrate the ways in which disability and the colonial are already interlocked, and thus to further argue that to approach either without the other is ignoring this mutually reinforcing relationship. Now, for the sake of time, I will be showing a few slides with quotes on them that I am not reading the entire quote of, but you can read in your own time. So this first part is metaphors shape our thinking and thus our realities. So on the one hand, disability itself is often treated as a frontier to be conquered. Thus, it is subject to colonial metaphors. You can see in this quote the idea of mapping disability as a foreign land and approaching disability from a distanced curiosity. On the other hand, disability has also been used as a framework for othering colonized peoples in order to justify colonization generally. The colonized have been figured as disabled in a variety of ways. So the concept is flexible and capacious and is a useful weapon during the incarceration, elimination, and removal of colonial others. Yet, both fields of inquiry and activism elide each other for the most part, never moving beyond descriptive metaphors. These uses of metaphor are important rhetorically because they structure how we think about the world. But we need to be very careful when exploring the metaphorical connections between disability and coloniality so that the particularity of material conditions and lived experiences is not subsumed by abstract language. So let's get particular. Colonialism functions through bodily violence, maiming, killing, raping, and the slow violence of environmental degradation and cultural erasure. Colonial and neo-colonial violence causes material impairments to actual body minds, not just metaphorical disabilities on abstract populations. Additionally, the lived experience of disablement positions actual people under a violent medical gaze, often institutionalizing them and profiting from studies about them. This lived experience reinforces power structures instituted by settler colonialism and furthered by neocolonialism. For another example, in the recent BLM movement, Black Lives Matter, it often goes unnoted that several of the Black men and women who have been killed through police violence, such as Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, and Sandra Bland, were also people with impairments, reported by media as underlying conditions. In fact, terms such as underlying conditions serve to not only mask disability, but also mask the working of colonial power that may have led to disablement. As if the underlying conditions are not intimately related to the violence that finally ended the lives in question. As if the power structures in which we live did not already violently disable these Black men and women before the final crushing blow of police violence ended their lives. So what would it mean to crip the decolonial and to decolonize disability studies? To crip the decolonial, first, we recognize the interrelationship of disability and coloniality in the metaphorical register that shapes our thinking and the material register that shapes our body minds. To say, for instance, that to rely on an accommodation for learning is a crutch is to simultaneously devalue the lives of folks with mobility impairments and to insist on a model of productivity that relies on individual responsibility that upholds a neoliberal value system, which is an outgrowth and continuation of coloniality. To be truly decolonial, we cannot accept such thinking. To decolonize disability studies, we must engage a broader view than the narrow understanding of disability offered by a Euro-American-centric academia or activist struggle. I mentioned earlier CDS and GDS, critical disability studies and global disability studies, both of which are newer academic fields responding to this need for a broader view in disability studies scholarship. Critical disability studies grows from critical race theory and engages with the presumed whiteness of mainstream disability studies. Global disability studies also accounts for race, but from an explicitly decolonial position that centers perspectives from the global South. I'm going to share one last slide that I find useful. This is a table in the Dearth and Adams article that I cited earlier. And I'm just going to point out a few of the strategies that they point out here. And I'm going to rephrase them in my own language here. So some strategies, decolonial strategies that they point out. Understanding sickness and disability as a product of cultural and physical environment. Understanding disability as a marginalized group identity with a history. Questioning seemingly common sense understandings of well-being that actually are produced by and reinforce power structures that leave us struggling alone. Questioning, disrupting, and changing social and physical arrangements that not only impair individuals, but also disable entire communities and cultures in the global South. Thank you for listening and/or watching and reading along. I hope that thinking through these intersections might give us all new avenues for activism and daily living. I will pass it along.
Thanks so much, Lydia. And we'll move now to Zahi.
Okay, visible for everybody? Excellent. So thank you, Nicole. The Me Too hashtag triggered by actress Alyssa Milano galvanized victims to call out their abuser and tormentors. The French translation of Me Too, and here I'll give you the French, balance ton porc, call out your pig, rendered this imperative to call out even more explicit. And yet, Me Too was mired in controversy early on for its unacknowledged debt to an earlier Me Too movement organized 10 years earlier in 2007 by grassroots activist Tarana Burke. This earlier movement sought to help female victims of sexual harassment and assault in underprivileged racial communities. After seeing Milano's tweet, Burke said that she felt overwhelmed with panic, with a sense of dread, because something that was part of my life's work was going to be co-opted and taken from me and used for a purpose that I hadn't originally intended. If Burke's movement focused on women of color, the most vulnerable of women, Me Too placed privileged women of Hollywood, basically female celebrities, at the center of the movement, generating mass media interest. Though, one must add, it was never clear if the initial public interest in the coverage stemmed from people's sense of social outrage over abuse of powerful men or from the story's sensational content. In other words, were people moved by sexual injustice or simply by sex? Sexual harassment and sexual violence are unfortunately nothing new. And yet Me Too did jolt the general, mostly male public out of its numbing indifference, out of its feminist slumber, so to speak, exposing the dark underside of liberal democracy and setting in motion a revolutionary desire for transformative change beyond the liberal system's assurances and promises of equality and respect. But the whiteness of Me Too, at least in its inception, did stall its potential for collective political action, with many Black activists dismissively designating Me Too's digital activism as a white feminist movement, a feminism mostly concerned with protecting the identity of white, economically privileged women. Who comes to represent the face of Me Too is first and foremost a political question. Whiteness displaces, if not replaces, the minority faces of Burke's earlier movements. Is this a fair criticism of Me Too? My answer is yes and no. By focusing attention on individual testimonies through the use of the hashtag, the movement ran the risk of ignoring socioeconomic conditions, welcoming in turn a whitewash, depoliticized mode of activism, earning it the oxymoronic label of neoliberal feminism. A feminism not so much invested in critiquing male-dominated structures of power as in fortifying one's symbolic self and promoting a narrative of personal struggle and overcoming. At the same time, we must proceed carefully here and not engage in a form of victim blaming, blaming victims for not saying enough about the impact of the anonymous structures of male domination on women from underprivileged communities, blaming victims for treating their white victimization as an opportunity for profit and empowerment. The point of the debate, right, the point of decolonizing Me Too activism, is to critically assess the universal potential of the movement. Is this a movement? Is Me Too a movement open for all women? Is it an event open to all women? The problem with Me Too was, or currently is, that the movement takes it for granted that the victim or survivor of sexual violence is always already positioned as someone who counts. And of course, counting here does not immunize you from sexual predators. But is Me Too completely at fault here? Are the movement's shortcomings also connected to its reception, to what the media opens up and, more importantly, forecloses? It is not an exaggeration to say that the mainstream media outlet dulled the cutting edge of Me Too almost from the start. The outlets transformed the event of resisting sexual harassment into a spectacle of individual suffering, transfixing the image of harassment at the level of what social theorist Slavoj Žižek calls subjective violence. Subjective violence, the type of violence that is performed by a clearly identifiable agent and is seen as a perturbation of the normal, peaceful state of things. Sexual harassment is clearly an instance of subjective violence, but it is also more. To remain at this level, at the level of subjective violence, is to fall prey to the ideological pull of subjective violence. As Žižek puts it, there's something inherently mystifying in a direct confrontation with violence, with the overpowering horror of violent acts and empathy with victims inexorably function as a lure which prevents us from thinking. Representation of subjective violence masquerading as news are engrossing, always at risk of becoming a voyeuristic indulgence in women's suffering. Jacqueline Rose astutely observes, while attention to violence against women may be sparked by anger and a desire for redress, it might also feed vicariously off the forms of perversion that fuel the violence in the first place. Moral outrage slides into obscene enjoyment. Consuming subjective violence reproduces sexual violence. A transnational plea for Me Too would interrupt this consumerist hunger. It would turn Me Too's critical energy towards harassment as an instance of symbolic and systemic violence, what Zizek would call objective violence. Questioning a global system that reproduces men and installs in them an aura of invincibility and sovereignty. I can harass with impunity. To transnationalize the American Me Too movement, to make its feminism universal, the movement must trouble its own positionality and take on the critical hermeneutic challenge to read up the ladder of privilege, as Chandra Mohanty puts it. To adhere to this injunction would be to place marginalized women of color at the center of Me Too. To transnationalize Me Too would be to decolonize Me Too's activism. The move to transnationalize Me Too brings the focus back to capitalism. To be sure, capitalism, from its neoliberal fetish of the market to its logic of exploitation and instrumentalization of all bodies, has severely weakened the previous authority of patriarchy. And yet, patriarchy is clearly enjoying a second life under capitalism, functioning as an ideology that nurtures a hypermasculinity that elevates and falsely universalizes the male perspective, engendering a misogynistic horizon within which women are a priori sexually harassable and men are given license to dominate women, where harassment is the harasser's right, his male privilege. To insist on the hegemony of patriarchy, to focus on patriarchy in isolation, away from the system of capitalism, away from the socioeconomic and cultural structures conditioning our existence and relation to others, is to neoliberalize feminism, to imagine a feminism winning the struggle against patriarchal domination without having to alter society's economic coordinates, bracketing, as it were, the struggle against exploitation. Again, is this version of feminism open to all? With an eye for symbolic violence, a transnational feminism pays attention to the ways girls and women living in a patriarchal universe of meaning are habitually interpolated as intimate objects, ready at hand for sexual harassment or coercion. The Not Your Habibti hashtag by Palestinian American woman Yasmin Mjali, which creatively translates Me Too as not your Habibti, is hard to translate. Occasionally find it as darling. I don't know who uses darling anymore. I think sweetheart might be a better translation. So I'm not your Habibti, not your sweetheart. This hashtag exposes and disrupts patriarchy's soft power, its fake proximity or assumption of intimacy under the guise of the inoffensive word Habibti, sweetheart. And here, it shows clearly that language creates disparities between men and women. One is a desiring subject, the locus of agency, the other a reified object awaiting male affection, producing and sustaining a sense of inferiority among women. To challenge the patriarchal state of affairs requires a universalist intervention, an intervention that breaks with the pervasive rhetoric of identity politics, which is quite popular within a kind of Me Too feminist camp. It is here that Mohanty's decolonizing intervention feminist debate is most relevant. How to challenge and transform the state of affairs does not follow a ready-made recipe, or rather the recipe itself calls for specificity. Within a tightly integrated capitalist system, the particular standpoint of poor indigenous or third world South women provides the most inclusive viewing of systemic power. Feminists in general must learn to beat up the ladder of privilege. This decolonial lesson is less familiar to feminists of the global North, with Me Too serving as an important reminder of this fundamental lack. For Mohanty, universality is not embedded in society's elites and identity politics masquerading as universal, pretending to speak for all women. Universality is to be found in society's least privileged, starting at the bottom of the ladder of privilege. Such an approach avoids what she calls ethnocentric universality, a colonial mode of Western thinking that posits that posit women as a coherent, already constituted group that is placed in kinship, legal, and other structures, defines third world women as subject outside social relations instead of looking at the way women are constituted through the very structures. Mohanty is highly critical of this kind of identity-based feminism, which construes third world women as always already oppressed, in need of rescue due to their cultural backwardness, always from the perspective of Western standards. This form of easy universalism also generates Robin Morgan's concept of global sisterhood, which can only homogenize women. A global feminism, which excludes the effects of neo-imperialism, is a feminism akin to the neoliberal kind. Both feminisms ignore or cover over the plight of the women who stand for society's excluded others. If one of the ideological tricks of patriarchy is to naturalize its mode of domination, circulating cultural fantasies of masculine control over a feminine or feminized body, patriarchy is all too willing to collaborate with whiteness and settler colonialism. Operation Protective Edge, the 2014 Israeli-Gaza war, is a case in point. Here, patriarchy infiltrates itself in the masculinization of Israeli Jews and its feminization of Gazans. Consider this obscene Israeli reaction posted on Facebook by a female teenager who has more than 1,000 followers. What an orgasm to see Israeli Defense Forces bomb buildings in Gaza with children and families at the same time. Boom, boom. Or consider this despicable post addressed to Prime Minister Netanyahu, which reached a broader audience on Israeli social media, displaying a veiled woman labeled Gaza naked from the waist down, holding the following message. Bibi, finish me inside this time, signed citizens in favor of a ground assault. Watching the massacre of Palestinians is like watching a snuff film. Palestinians are perversely interpolated in this rape fantasy, starting Netanyahu as the patriarch, as the rapist in chief. Do Western feminists care about another Gaza war? Do they care about Palestinians? Does the resistance to patriarchy cover Israel's hypermasculinization of Jewish citizens, along with the circulation of rape fantasies and metaphors? Is solidarity between feminists, Western feminists, and third world feminism possible? These are the type of uncomfortable questions that decolonizing activism and decolonizing feminism must necessarily raise. While critical of Western feminism, Mohanty does not give up on the emancipatory force of the feminist struggle. The possibility of what she calls feminist solidarity, a feminism across boundaries, must not be ruled out, since without the struggle against global capitalism only can be expanded. But her point is crucial. Differences, right? The differences between Western feminists and feminists of the global South must not be fetishized, categorized, or ontologized, but compared. They are to serve as a basis for a shared universal project of emancipation. In knowing differences and particularities, we can better see the connections and commonalities because no border or boundary is ever complete or rigidly determining. The challenge is to see how differences allow us to explain the connections and border crossing better and more accurately, how specifying the difference allows us to theorize universal concerns more fully. What feminist solidarity must adhere to, though, is a serious engagement with the global South, which, as Bonaventura de Sousa Santos as he understands it, is not a geographical concept, even though the great majority of its population live in countries of the Southern Hemisphere, but instead a metaphor for the human suffering caused by capitalism and colonialism on the global level, as well as for the resistance to overcoming or minimizing such suffering. So just a aside here, there's a lot that disagree with De Sousa Santos over his vision of decoloniality, but on this point, I think he's correct. Feminist solidarity is a global solidarity of the exploited and the oppressed of the global South in its geographical and figurative sense. The poor, indigenous, and the third world South women stand for social justice and for universality as such. And this is still Mohanty. If we pay attention to and think through the space of some of the most disenfranchised communities of women in the world, we're most likely to envision a just and democratic society capable of treating all of its citizens fairly. So can Me Too read up the ladder of privilege? Right? That's the challenge, right? If it can read the ladder, up the ladder of privilege, it would have to foreground the experience of invisible Native Americans who in the United States have the highest rate of sexual violence. Another way of reading up the ladder of privilege is for white feminists to question their demand to believe women, to suspend due process and acknowledge the history of racial violence in the United States behind Black men and boys being wrongfully accused by white women. Let's not forget how in 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till was accused of sexually threatening a white woman in a Mississippi store, then horrifically lynched. This story helps to explain the reluctance of some Black women to give Me Too a blanket endorsement. As Ashwini Tambi observes, the dynamics of Me Too, in which due process has been reversed with accusers' word taken more seriously than those of the accused, is a familiar problem in Black communities. Maybe some Black women want no part of this dynamic. This is a point of difficult negotiation since it brings to the full weight of an intersectional reality to bear on Me Too. Black women, as Kimberly Crenshaw powerfully explained, are also caught in the double bind. Should I call out my Black sexual harasser, victimizer? Or should I protect, not betray my community and remain silent? No feminism worthy the name should ignore this heart-wrenching predicament. So to conclude, when white feminists object to patriarchy, their objection often avoids questions of race and racism, and thus they are prone to repeating society's systemic violence. They forget that, to borrow the words of Frank Wilderson, white people are not simply protected by the police, they are the police. The label Karen names and makes visible the social phenomenon of middle-aged women, white women who function as the police, displaying their particular white privilege in monitoring the behavior of supposedly suspicious Black men, eagerly dispatching the actual police to assist. And even if white women and feminists are not actively engaged in the policing of Black bodies, they remain complicit with the matrix of racism when they exclude or remain indifferent to the plight of non-white, disenfranchised women, when only the beneficiaries of global capitalism can freely register the complaint against patriarchy or sexual harassment. The future of Me Too serves as a test case for thinking the viability of feminist solidarity, a universal politics by another name.
Thank you, Zahi. And we'll move to our third speaker tonight, Özge.
Thank you, Nicole. The title of my talk today is Violence and Civility in Times of Riots and Uprising, and it's composed of 3 parts. The first part is titled, In the Beginning Was the Commune. For those who had begun to grow uneasy about the seeming closure of the 2008-2013 cycle with its urban riots, anti-austerity struggles, square occupations, and in the case of Tunisia and Egypt, mass movements able to depose entrenched, if senile, autocratic regimes, the age of riots has only just begun. As the 2 great empires collapsed political life into socialist electoral hopes in 2019, matters proceeded quite differently at empire's peripheries, where Santiago, Beirut, Hong Kong, Port-au-Prince, Quito burned. When the history of the long 2020 is written, the current Black-led anti-police uprising, the most intense, extensive, and long-lasting riot wave since the 1960s, will no doubt be seen as one chapter in an anti-police movement whose principal episodes comprise the Oscar Grant riots in 2009 and 10 in Oakland, then riots in Ferguson, Baltimore, and other cities in 2014 and 2015, sometimes referred to as Black Lives Matter. Today, that slogan still functions as the watchword of the movement, painted across 1,000 boarded up storefronts and down the middle of streets. But that axiom has been developed, and from it, abolish the police, or more often, defund the police, has emerged as the accepted directive demand of the movement, taking up space that otherwise vague calls for social justice might have occupied. An age of riots knows a politics of the street. The politics of incivility can take many forms, but is first and foremost defined by its distinction from and even antagonistic contempt for the juridical sphere and its formalizations on the one hand, and its material separation from the workplace on the other. As Alberto Toscano argues, one of the decisive theoretical contributions made by the Italian workerist tradition, the thesis of the social factory, argued that the era of real subsumption meant first and foremost the re-articulation of the relation between factory and city, between production and the social. Such a topology has as a consequence a tightening of the ties between production and circulation, even their material inseparability. But this very integration is founded, paradoxically, on an increasing remoteness of that elusive point of production. It leaves the streets then to us and to the police. And these streets command specific tactics, forms of activity we have witnessed for the last decade: the taking and holding of space, the blocking of roads, bridges, and ports, fitful attacks on the commodity itself. Such riots, for all their vigor and all their necessity, mount an attack on simple commodity exchange, precisely because they can't mount an attack on capital itself. These are their limits. This threshold, this so-called glass floor that the assaults of street politics cannot shatter, however many brittle shop windows lie at the feet of these so-called, by David Harvey no less, feral rioters, in turn pushes these energies back onto a site they set out to avoid at all costs: the state and its periodic reshuffling of parties. To speak of the present age as a time of riots is also to anticipate a moment when the accumulation of riots, from the commodity riots of the 2011 London sort to the current wave which stretched police forces too thin for crowd control, forms a pattern that begins to take on a certain disordered coherence. It's also to anticipate a moment when this proliferation of struggles will begin to seek both an intensification in the content of their demands, as well as an urgent need to find the key to their coordination and take on a consistency. In his introduction to the actuality of communism, Bruno Bostiles notes, without necessarily endorsing Alain Badiou's contention, that in the coming cycle of struggles, or in the new sequence of the communist hypothesis, the crucial starting point for communist politics will be the politics of the Paris Commune, if not the form of the Commune as such. The completion of the history of Marxism results in a form of regression to a point prior to the consolidation of the Leninist conception of the party. We are once again capable of starting from scratch. The Commune is the name for the new beginning. 2, the right form and the Commune. The circuit of capital has within it, as Marx notes, two moments that form a perfect dialectic, at once unified and antagonistic. The moment MC, wherein the capitalist purchases and combines the means of production, and the moment CM, wherein the commodities thus produced circulate in the marketplace. These moments orient to two spheres of capital's being, the factory and the marketplace, but more properly production and circulation. Marx recalls that these spheres, in addition to being useful abstractions within the complex process of capital's expanded reproduction, have abode, one a noisy sphere. These then provide the logic for the two modes of struggle that Joshua Clover names as strike and riot in Riot, Strike, Riot, metonyms for production and circulation struggles, respectively. Clover meditates on the shift from the former to the latter, production to circulation, as capital with its waning capacity for accumulation at a global scale and concomitant waning absorption of labor relocates its own way towards circulation struggles for profit. And in a dialectical duet, the process of proletarianization also shifts away from absorption into the wage and away from production, tilting over into the often wageless life of circulation. It's here that Clover discovers a foundational difference between Marx and Fanon in their conceptualization of the lumpen proletariat. Surely all remember the litany in the 18th Brumaire. Quote, vagabonds, discharged soldiers, jailbirds, escaped galley slaves, swindlers, mountebanks, lazzarini, pickpockets, tricksters, gamblers, brothel keepers, porters, literati, organ grinders, rack pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, beggars. In short, the whole indefinite, disintegrated mass. As Marx says, decisively counter-revolutionary, subject to the sway of whoever held the day. For Fanon, the matter appears contrarily. These men, he writes, forced off the family land by the growing population in the countryside and by colonial expropriation, circle the towns tirelessly, hoping that one day or another they will be let in. It's among these masses and the people of the shanty towns and in the lumpen proletariat that the insurrection will find its urban spearhead. The lumpen proletariat, this cohort of starving men, divorced from tribe and clan, constitutes one of the most spontaneously and radically revolutionary forces of a colonized people. End of quote. Lest one think he's talking about some other social fraction, he immediately conjures Marx's litany. So the pimps, the hooligans, the unemployed, and the petty criminals, when approached, give the liberation struggle all they have got, devoting themselves to the cause like valiant workers. End of quote. You can hear in that last gesture that he's thinking about the same problem, like valiant workers, and yet not workers at all. It's hard not to understand that concluding simile as a specific demand on orthodox Marxism, to understand the surplus population as part of an expanded proletariat, as class revolutionaries. One sees in the worlds detailed by Marx and Fanon distinct solutions to Aimé César's two problems of the proletariat in the metropole and the excluded in the colony. Two forms of potential surplus. One solution is economic expansion, the capacity to take that potential surplus population into the circuits of accumulation. This is the regime of absorption. The other is open and imminent violence directed against those for whom every doorway is labeled no entry, a cruel, ironic circumstance in that they are trapped in a colonial world itself, forever labeled no exit. While the former features and arguably depends on racialized exclusion, on moments of internal colonization that is subordinated to capital self-expansion and intensification at the scale of national economy. While the latter is subject to the constraints of global capitalist relations, it is not an absorptive capitalism, at least not absorptive enough to challenge what Fanon insists is the historical speciation which divides colonizer and colonized. And it is from within these two regimes, absorption and coloniality, that the lumpen appear differently. Here as counter-revolutionary drags, here as revolutionary edge. But the further thing to note, and perhaps this is obvious, is that the distance between these two regimes is closing. Rather than colonial regimes moving toward absorptive capitalism, the great promise of development, the reduction of all life to the homogeneity of simple labor, development has meant that the high-wage nations are losing their capacity to absorb. These nations, where the regime of absorption has run up against historical limits, are, one might say, recolonizing. At a minimum, as surplus populations increase and wage discipline contracts, these nations develop modes of domestic securitization premised on direct domination, most visibly in the policing and hyper-incarceration of subordinated populations. Hence, it's also the character of this historical moment, the moment that absorption is exhausted, that the lumpen, those excluded from the wage, consistently along racialized lines, take on the political significance seen by Fanon. Now that I have moved swiftly through Clover's argument, there is room for the question that concerns the sphere that is both of and not of capital, which is the sphere wherein the proletariat reproduces itself in their own circuit. The sphere has been given many names: subsistence, social reproduction, reproduction of labor power, the last of which focuses on its function for capital. It's necessarily distinct from the dilemma of capital with its two horns of strike and riot, production and circulation, expanding and contracting capital, one premised on wage dependency, one premised on market dependency, one centered by labor, one centered by lumpen, one arising from the exhaustion of the other. What is the form of struggle adequate to the sphere of proletarian reproduction? The reproduction struggle I'm trying to grasp as a continuity with the riot, most evidently in moments when the circulation struggle and the reproduction struggle are hard to distinguish. The ZAD in France, Zone de France, No TAV in the Sousa Valley, the No DAPL movement at Standing Rock, provide clarifying examples in the ways that these confrontations drive from the entanglement of absorptive and colonial modes and give versions of what I'm trying to think about: paradigmatic sites of circulation, airports and train lines, and pipeline blockades that were also for a time self-reproducing communities. Circulation struggle and reproduction struggle at once, encampment as confrontation, confrontation as encampment, care work as barricade, barricade as care work, which seeks to move beyond price setting, beyond the street uprising, the political call that says beneath the paving stone sovereignty, beyond the exhaustion of the riot's capacity to secure subsistence for itself. The sphere of reproduction is home to all humans, if one understands that capitalists are demons. It's the dwelling place of laborers recognized by traditional Marxism, but also women, children, the peasantry, the aged, the unemployed, as Christian Rose says in Communal Luxury. For all that, the sphere is historically gendered in the material sense of gender as something first seized upon and then reproduced by capital to assure unwaged reproductive labor towards its own reproduction and expansion. Indeed, just as the sphere of circulation is not only a place of racialized exclusion and domination, but a site where race is produced, the sphere of reproduction is both a place of gendered exclusion and domination, and the place where gender is produced, an argument I first encountered in the work of the Italian Marxist feminists. At the same time, the sphere of reproduction appears to be the root of withdrawal, of retreat for those damaged by capital, and thus the space of care work, which thereby becomes gendered. From these two features, one understands gender under capitalism as involving a double ration of misery that in inverted form provides the basis of the commune, of reproduction beyond wage and market. One understands through this double ration how the commune of withdrawal is an inadequate horizon. The foreshortened logic of withdrawal from capital's damaged life is a withdrawal that demands care, care which has not yet been transformed, care that comes already gendered. But how might one reject this foreshortened withdrawal from capital that leaves its gender division of labor undisturbed? And this leads me to the other fundamental matter of the commune, which might be formulated as a further question. How can the commune organize itself as a war machine, transcending the fantasy of passive delinking so as to confront state and capital directly? Though capital will no doubt smile on the rebirth of subsistent gardens for its reserve army, it cannot allow large-scale withdrawal. A commune is a war machine, whether one wishes this or not, and the commune, as I understand it, necessarily pushes toward civil war. Perhaps it's simply the name for the push towards reproduction as self-activity in a way that capital can neither tolerate nor survive. I want to situate the becoming civil war of the commune as counter-reproduction in a third or supplementary position in relation to the dilemmas of politics, both liberal and radical, whether it be that of war or peace, order or disorder, institution or insurrection, strike or riots, communism or anarchism. In its own working existence, its operation as commune, counter-reproduction makes a claim of sovereignty, a claim on territory. In so doing, it takes its place as well within the ascending significance of circulation struggles. The commune as a mode of proletarian reproduction that makes the smooth reproduction of capital difficult, if not impossible. And it is, I think, the gendered aspect of the sphere of reproduction, seemingly non-economic through the appearance of wagelessness, in truth, the doubly hidden abode of capitalist reproduction that makes possible the double confrontation of counter-reproduction. It's the name for a collective mode of existence in which the separation between the economic and the political, between living and struggle, tends to disappear. Perhaps this double confrontation of counter-reproduction is another name for abolition. As the abolitionist thinker Dylan Rodriguez defines it, quote, abolition is not merely a practice of negation, a collective attempt to eliminate institutionalized dominance over targeted peoples and populations, but also a radically imaginative, generative, and socially productive, communal, and community building practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of our panelists. So we'll move now to the question and answer, the discussion portion of the evening. So audience members, please feel free to use the Q&A box to type up your questions. And panelists too, I'll invite you to just jump in or signal if you'd like to ask one another questions. And the first thought I had, I mean, thinking about this your last comments, Özge, on abolition as generative practice and not just negation. I'm seeing some echoes in all three papers, but wondering if those echoes are actually echoes and continuities or an effect of me listening to the three of you together. But thinking about generation versus negation and the limits of withdrawal as a framework. I'm wondering how that relates to the notion of reading up the ladder as a kind of model of continuity or universal design too, that's also approaching kind of the disruption of the status quo from a perspective of continuity, that being that there's starting at the bottom of the ladder, starting from a universal perspective impacts everyone rather than kind of looking towards one segment of a population in order to create a breach with the rest, if that makes sense.
Maybe I can begin this discussion because when I was listening to Özge's talk, I also thought about the lumpen proletarian, which is an amazing figure. But Zizek recently evokes the lumpen proletarian and describes that figure as less than nothing. So whereas you have, the classic worker who's supposed to become this kind of revolutionary subject is nothing within the capitalist system, right? He or she only has their labor power to sell. they're nothing. The lumpen proletariat are less than nothing. So reading up the ladder of privilege, and since you begin with less than nothing, not just nothing as a kind of as a meaning within a capitalist system, you're nothing. The less than nothing, in a sense, is drawing attention to even the workers have some kind of buy-in within the system. So to really break from the system, you have to imagine a space, not necessarily outside the system, but at the very limit of the system, or the 0 degree of the system.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's, I think, how I imagine the surplus populations, right?
Yeah.
Like they have no access to, you know, to wage.
Yeah.
But they're still dependent on the market. So like they're present, and their presence has to be managed, but they're, you know, completely disposable.
And so would this be the way that Fanon kind of decolonizes the revolutionary subject by bringing back the lumpen proletarian into the equation? I mean, is he doing kind of a decolonizing avant la lettre?
Well, I mean, the wretched of the earth, like what kind of a subject is that, right? Like when you name the, so. But I mean, it's interesting to think about the less than nothing, since, you know, like these Italian workers' tradition that I'm infatuated with, you know, it's like people like Mario Tronti. So they were also arguing that, you know, like the worker is actually part of capital. And so like you actually had to negate yourself, like abolish, you know, the proletariat itself. So in that sense, you know, the relationship between the lumpen and the wretched and the less than nothing is extremely interesting.
And for Zizek, now it's the kind of global refugees that seem to occupy the space, and the ambivalence of, you know, European workers looking at these refugees who are coming as a threat, right? So doubling down on their nothing, which is better than less than nothing, which is what they see the refugee as standing for.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because the worker is constantly reproducing capital.
And this is a little bit of a shift in topic, but all three of you, I think, touched on the relationship between metaphorical registers and epistemic frameworks and material conditions on bodies and economies, on the other hand. And I'm wondering how your perspective on that interrelationship informs how you think about the relationship between theory and activism, or scholarship as activism. And I think this is, I mean, this is a question that I grapple with my students too. What's the relationship of theory of scholarship to material change? And I think all three of your talks and thinking about that relationship between epistemic frameworks, metaphors, the metaphorical register, and then the materialities of bodies and economies and spaces might get us at that question.
I'm sorry, Nicole, I had to step away for a second, so I missed the beginning of what you were asking.
Yeah, so how, I think all three talks, you all touched on the kind of relationship between metaphorical registers and material bodies and economies. And that got me thinking about the question of theory and activism, or theory and material change, or scholarship as activism. And I was wondering if the three of you wanted to say a little bit about that, about how you see that relationship.
Well, I mean, I guess one thing that I'm grappling with is, especially, you know, starting this summer, where I started to read Sven Lazarus, so like these French Maoists, and, you know, this question of can politics be taught? Can, you know, like movements, do they think? And so instead of like introducing theory and theoretical discourses in order to understand or grasp different political movements, like begin to think about how there is a particular kind of political thinking, and to be able to engage with that, like to think from within the organizations, you know, with their idioms, with their vocabularies, without introducing any other theoretical vocabulary is something that I'm still reflecting upon. Because I mean, in my research on hunger strikes, so I'm working with a lot of philosophies of death and time, which is not necessarily the language of my interlocutors. So how to mediate between my language and the language of my interlocutors, and is still very conflictual. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that's very difficult. Your question, Nicole, and one of the resources that I put on at the end of my talk, if people accessed it, is a book by Jay Dolmage called Academic Ableism, and it very much calls into question in what ways we as academics are participating in a system that is disabling the majority of people. Yeah, and that calls into question what kind of activism do we do then as academics, right? Yeah, I don't have an easy answer.
And what is our relationship to, I mean, theory is not immaterial either. I mean, we do our work in very particular conditions. There are conditions that enable us to do our work, right?
I'll try to answer here. I mean, theorists and activists tend to be suspicious of each other. I mean, that's a fact. I mean, if I was to read this title for the panel from the outside, although I was part of coming up with the title, I could be very suspicious. So what is this? Another kind of retreat from critical thinking, for the kind of immediacy, the spontaneity of activism. Thinking is bad. I think the kind of theorists that I evoked in the paper, Mohanty, doesn't give up on the project of the universal just because Western discourse, right, has kind of fetishized a vision of the universal that is abstract, hiding its male, its heteronormativity, its whiteness. Doesn't mean then you retreat in the kind of, which is one form of decoloniality. It's kind of to retreat in the kind of one's own particular non-Western sphere. But this non-Western sphere is also imagines a space that is prior to capitalism. So activists become just, we have to disengage from capitalism rather than attack the beast that is capitalism. And I think theorists are wary of this kind of feel-good activism, right? In a sense, and capitalism in a sense welcomes this kind of feel-good activism because it tells you, look at, we're allowing self-critique. So please be active, contribute to reforming capitalism. So I think, theorists and activists, in a sense, have to conceptualize what are the moves against capitalism, what are the short-term interventions that are needed, but then those short-term interventions can't lose sight of the long projects. What are we doing? If you're committed to a kind of leftist vision of emancipation, what are you doing? Is activism the only option? I don't think so. Theorizing without a sense of how do you impact materially the world, of course, is ridiculous. But no serious theorist endorses that position either.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience about the relationship between decolonization and Marxism. And it's a question about how those two relate to one another and whether we as a panel can clarify a bit that relationship.
I mean, I can begin. I mean, they have also kind of tough relation. I mean, I always reminded of Fanon's critique of Sartre, who was, endorsed the négritude movement as a good kind of first moment. You're kind of negating bourgeois culture, right? Capitalist bourgeois culture. But you have to look at You have to look at the final point, which is a classless society that only a Marxist model gets you there. Even though Fanon was very critical of the négritude movement, he blamed Sartre for de-emphasizing the affective force of négritude, which basically gave colonized folks, Black folks, a reason to be re-enchanted with their being. So I think post-colonial, anti-colonial theorists are suspicious of a Marxist reading that just brackets race as an epiphenomenon of capitalism. And even Harvey does that. At some level, he's not really engaged like Black Lives Matter. He doesn't see Black Lives Matter as an anti-capitalist movement. Other Marxists are more open to foregrounding race, and usually comes out of kind of post-colonial theorists who are Marxists as well.
Well, I think it's also a critique of this kind of philosophy of history, which is linear and stagist, so that, you know, that as if there's no possibility of arriving, or there's no possibility of history to unfold, right? And I think for Marx, I mean, right now, you know, like within Marxism, people are really interested in Marx's kind of letters with Russian Marxists. And so like thinking about the Russian commune and how to, you know, arrive at communism without necessarily going through capitalism. So I think that's one way of decolonizing Marxism today, you know, to think about these alternative historical projects.
But I think it's very, I mean, with global capitalism, how can you do that? How can you not go through, I mean, not go through it in terms of a stage, but it seems that the reach of global capitalism is hard. I mean, this is Mignolo's, you know, you can theorize critique without foregrounding capitalism. But I think, I don't know, I'm suspicious of that gesture, of that form of decolonial strategies. So Mohanty decolonizes the universal, but she's still engaged in a kind of universal project, feminist solidarity between feminists from the global north, global south. And for her, capitalism is the problem, which is, right, she doesn't play the game of retreating away from Western influence.
I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a kind of withdrawal, but maybe a kind of a translational project, which did not happen, and which might have happened, but didn't. So like these kind of missed encounters. Yeah. I don't know, I guess I immediately think of the Zapatistas, you know, like these 8 intellectuals who end up in this forest and then, you know, like learn the language and then, you know, thinking about the possibility of this kind of encounter producing a different emancipatory project.
Özge, are you suggesting that is possible now, or you know, you're talking about missed, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are, I mean, I don't know, like I'm just talking from within the kind of the Marxian and Marxist literature that's happening today. Like I think that kind of decolonizing move is happening in the sense that it's, you know, trying to think of the commune not only as the Paris commune, right? So like Bruno Bostiel's, you know, writing about Mexico, and so thinking about these other histories, like non-Western histories, and, you know, how we could learn from them. And
Zahi used the terms transnationalize and decolonized. I wondered if you could talk a bit more about the differences or the similarities between those two terms.
Yeah, so
as you're using them.
Yeah, I would say I'm using it in a specific way to decolonize Me Too to decolonize feminism, to decolonize the universal, is in a sense to make it, in the Hegelian sense, more concrete. And this is something that requires a transnational gesture, in a sense, to establish distance vis-a-vis Western concepts. The dominant vision of the universal within Western discourse still tends to be abstract, the kind of liberal model of the universal subject, where race, gender are bracketed. This vision of the abstract universal has to be decolonized. But it can be decolonized in numerous ways. You can retreat into the kind of concrete particular of any national configuration, especially non-Western, becomes very popular. Or you can go through the universal and try through kind of dialectical thinking and make it actually concrete. So the transnational gesture that Mohanty kind of does with the global North and global South, for me, is a work of decolonization, but in the name of the universal, or in the name of making feminism a universal project, rather than a kind of identity politics that then could be transplanted, right? You know, you can have identity politics in France, you can have identity politics in Mexico, in Brazil. I think now more than ever, still within a kind of leftist Marxist tradition, there is a kind of revival of a leftist project that reconfigures the revolutionary subject as such. So it's no longer the classic worker that is going to become the revolutionary subject. For Mohanty, women of color, indigenous bodies become the universal embodiment. I mean, that's a universal I can believe in, right? So I'm happy endorsing that version of the universal, which then assumes that the universal is what society excludes. So whoever were initially excluded becomes part of the dominant regime, then they're no longer the universal. They're compromised, right? They have a nice position within the count, to use Rancière.
Yeah.
The count. So it's a part of no part that should interest universal thinkers.
Zahi, could you maybe unpack a little bit for me when you're talking about this? I'm thinking about the translations of the Me Too movement, the examples that you gave in your talk. How do you feel that, and I'm sorry, I took notes and I listened to it, but how are these, are they functioning to decolonize, or are they successfully participating in this transnational gesture of feminism that Mohanty is talking about, or are they a kind of confrontation?
I mean, in its current vision, right? I mean, this is the kind of focus, the emphasis I gave. Who's going to be the face of Me Too? Is it Alyssa Milano, or is it Tarana Burke and the women of color that she's evoking? And I think it matters, right? And the interests, the media interests in the Hollywood version of it, privileged white women wronged. If this becomes the face of Me Too, forget about decolonizing. It is a project of colonizing activism, because it's a kind of activism that is very much personalized, which goes very well with a kind of neoliberal version. So neoliberalism can co-opt any wrong. So I follow the critics who object to these, while also, pumping the brakes and warning about kind of blaming the victim logic here, right? I mean, you can be victimized and still be privileged within society. It doesn't immunize you from all forms of violence, as long as patriarchy is a dominant regime, right? Any woman becomes fair game for violence, regardless of her status. So what I'm trying to do is a plea, right? It's a kind of to transnationalize the movement. And if I had more time in my paper, I would have evoked the inspiration for this title is a controversial essay by Zizek, which calls kind of a leftist plea for Eurocentrism. which is a horrible title, right? Because it imagines, Zizek advocating for, Eurocentric thought. But for him, the universal project of those who are socially excluded from society, demanding rights that are applicable to all. And that's what makes a universal project, that your claims are not limited to your own particular group or self-interest. They're available to all, what Badiou would call an event. An event is open to all. So is Me Too going to be a movement that is open to all, or those who can maneuver some leverage on the system to get some rewards from the system, and then, in a sense, overcome their particular position? And that's why a lot of Black activists considered Me Too a white women's movement. I want to say, right, there are others who are more concerned. So Mohanty never spoke, to my knowledge, directly on Me Too, but I'm using her theoretical framework for conceptualizing a Me Too that actually addresses these concerns. And what would a universal Me Too movement look like? So whatever is happening in Mexico, whatever is happening in France, how can women, activists, feminists engage and make this a universal movement, a la BLM, right? And since both of them have the potential to be subversive movements, but they will be tempted along the way to become a kind of version of identity politics. And so far, BLM has been better at resisting the carrots that the system puts forward.
And we had another question from the audience about terminology. And Lydia, I wanted to ask you, because you you had a definition of decoloniality that you discussed, and you said you like it, but it's limited. And just to remind the audience, the quote was from Maldonado Torres. Decoloniality refers to efforts at rehumanizing the world, to breaking hierarchies of difference that dehumanize subjects and communities and that destroy nature, and to the production of counter discourses, counter knowledges, counter creative acts, and counter practices that seek to dismantle coloniality and to open up multiple other forms of being in the world. Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit more about what you like in that definition, where you see the limitations?
Sure. So I like that it's graspable, right? And I like the emphasis on production of counter discourses, counter knowledges, counter creative acts. I think that I have problems with the idea of rehumanizing. So yeah, because that's just a really troubled discourse, and I should mention that in the context of disability as well, right? I mean, it's completely troubled in the context of disability, in the context of race, in the context of any kind of settler colonial project, because defining one as inhuman, not human, is justification for then the violence. But it presumes a kind of an existence before that is human, that we can get back to. So that's the part that I would say is theoretically weak, maybe. But I like the emphasis on action of creating counter knowledges and counter creative acts. And I think that's very much in line with what Zahi's talking about, with the centering of, and Özge, centering of the less than nothing, right? As in order for those discourses, counter discourses, to be produced. That's where they have to come from. And then the other part that I am maybe uncomfortable about that definition is it even though it's concentrating on the production of these counter discourses, it's not talking directly about any kind of redress for violence, right? So it seems to be very future oriented and a little Pollyanna-esque in that.
Yeah, thanks, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think we have time for one more question. We do have one more question from the audience for Lydia and Özge. Communes, and I'll read it out. Communes and universal design are both forms of decolonizing space. Are there implications for decolonizing design that resonate with urban planning? And can communes be seen as a form of decolonizing design?
Interesting question, Matt. So I'll say, just before I answer that, I'll say that universal design as a principle is useful in that it's not retrofitting, but it also is still very much working within a system. So when you're talking about decolonizing design and urban planning, that feels like, would the urban planner design a commune, and then in what way is that decolonial? That feels maybe problematic. So even though I draw on the concept of universal design, and I think, and I try to use it in instruction as much as possible, I don't think that it's an unproblematic concept either. For the same reasons of the quote that we talked about before.
I mean, I haven't thought about the commune in terms of space, but kind of address it more from this question of reproduction. But, you know, like my one experience of the commune, which was Gezi, like your question makes me think about, you know, like the relationship between the kitchen, the library, the, you know, where the assembly takes place, and where this is happening. For instance, it was actually happening in this park, but the park was also on an Armenian cemetery, which was destroyed. So it's just like layers of both historical sedimentation, but also the relationship between, you know, like this space and the larger city. It's a very interesting question, except that these were, you know, like very temporary and not durational kind of spaces. So, you know, if it endured, you know, whether it will actually produce its own planning is, you know, is an open-ended question.
Lydia mentioned designer, and that, and your comments too, Özge, got me thinking about collective design versus a designer recipient kind of model too.
Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we have to stop there, but thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to the audience for joining us tonight. Just a reminder, this was recorded. I'll stop the recording now, and then hopefully we'll be able to get it posted with a transcript before too long. So thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.